talk more frequently with this man. He is amazing. And I discovered you can watch him because I've been watching him on Sling, Sling TV. I'm like, oh, and he's, of course, on SiriusXM on Progress. He's the author of many books. I brought him on to talk about the hidden history of American healthcare. But I feel like we need to be talking about some other things that he has written, including a book about oligarchs. And I don't know why my camera's not showing up, Smiz. But let me welcome the great Thom Hartmann is here. Hello, sir.
Hey, Karen. It's great to be here with you. Thanks for
Listen,
inviting me.
again, I don't know why we haven't talked more. I do listen to your show today. You have a book club that you do, and you were reading from a book. So I wanted to go through some things because we're in a particular time. I keep telling my audience, I feel like we're living in history right now. We are literally in history. Would you agree with that? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think this is one of those hinge points, one of those moments in time where everybody places everything as before or after, like 9/11 or World War II, Pearl Harbor, the war in Vietnam, these really big things that transform society. I completely agree with you.
In your other book, because you have a whole hidden history series where you talk about the oligarchs, you highlight Hungary as an example of what could happen here or what is happening. Is it what is happening here or what could happen here?
Both. We're halfway down the road.
Okay. Tell us where we are in your estimation as a nation, as a country.
Sure. Well, what happened in Hungary was Viktor Orban used in the 2010, I believe it was, when he was elected for the second time and really seized power. He used largely racism to achieve his position. You'll recall this was after George Bush bombed the crap out of Afghanistan and Iraq, and it was also after the Russians in the Arab Spring had happened, and then the Russians came in to support Assad in Syria. And the Russians have a huge deep water port in Syria, so they really needed to defend that. And so they came in and they just bombed. I mean, Aleppo, which is a city of 1 million people, they bombed it right to rubble, and killed millions of people or hundreds of thousands of people, and produced about 3-4 million Syrian refugees. And then there were over 1 million Afghan refugees and over a couple of million Iraqi refugees, and they were all flowing up into Europe. Germany took in 1 million of them. Sweden took in 300,000. I mean, it's just huge numbers of refugees, and they were brown skinned and they were Muslims, and that, produced a backlash. And so when Orban ran for president, his principal campaign slogan was build a wall, and
Wow.
on the southern border of Hungary to keep out the what do you call it? Syrian refugees. Excuse me, my computer just threw a window up at me. Take a second, just let me get rid of that. And Trump imitated that. He actually built the wall, and it's well fortified, and since then he once he really got power, he packed the courts. He engineered a system where his cronies, his buddies, could basically buy all the media properties in the country, any media organizations. They changed the rules around libel, which is something that the Republican Party is trying to do right now, and actually Clarence Thomas is beating this drum really hard in the Supreme Court. He and John Roberts both, they want to change the libel laws. They want to overturn the Times v. Sullivan decision, so that if you or I right now were to say anything about any political figure, no matter how terrible it is, Donald Trump eats babies, he can't sue us. He can't sue us for slander or libel because he's a public figure. That's the Time v. Sullivan decision. Orban reversed essentially the equivalent of that. And then he started shutting down media properties by suing them out of business, one after another, across Hungary. And then once they got shut down, he sold them off to his cronies. So now about 95% of all the media in Hungary is owned by billionaire oligarchs who are on his side. So basically the entire media landscape of Hungary is like Fox News and right-wing hate radio. And so what is, and then he gerrymandered, or the Hungarian equivalent of gerrymandering, all the electoral districts across Hungary so heavily that he and his party, Fidesz is his party, would never again lose an election. So, basically what you've got now is one man rule or one party rule, single party rule, which is what the Republican Party is trying to achieve. And in fact, this week, Orban is in China with Putin right now, sucking up to Xi. It's like autocrats of the world unite.
Thom Hartmann is here. Thom Hartmann. So I downloaded The Hidden History of American Oligarchy. We're going to talk about the hidden history of healthcare in America as well. But that book, and it's Reclaiming Our Democracy from the Ruling Class. Did we ever have a democracy? Is it something that could be reclaimed, or should this country be reimagined? Let me say it that way. Should this country and the Constitution be rewritten and reimagined?
Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff there to unpack. First of all, rewriting the entire Constitution could be a very dangerous thing to do. It's why the Koch brothers are pushing, or Charles Koch is pushing it so hard right now.
Is he? Wait, hold on. So I just parroted something that the Koch brothers are pushing?
Yeah, about 15 years ago, they started this thing called Convention of States, and conventionofstates.com is their website. Or maybe it's .org. I'm not sure. It's one or the other. And under Article 5 of the Constitution, normally when you amend the Constitution, it starts in Congress and then they push it out to the states, and 3/4 of the states have to ratify it. Under this system, any state can call a convention and rewrite the entire Constitution or just come up with individual amendments to it. Again, you have to have 3/4 of the states on board to do it, and then it requires 2/3 of Congress to accept it. But it's never been done that way. Every one of the 27 amendments to the Constitution started in Congress. They're trying to do this. And for 10 years, for more than a decade now, they've been rehearsing every year in Washington, D.C. They bring in hundreds of people from all 50 states, and they hold a dress rehearsal for rewriting the Constitution top to bottom. They want to do away with public education. They want to do away with Social Security. They want to basically change the Constitution so that it is unconstitutional for government to do things that basically help ordinary people. They want to reinvent America in their libertarian worldview.
Okay, so I brought it up because after apartheid supposedly fell in South Africa, they rewrote the Constitution, because in this current Constitution, and the way I'm looking at it is the 3/5 compromises in there, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, but the but clauses in there, in order to form, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, didn't imagine me, the people, didn't imagine my people. So I'm thinking we should have a Constitution that includes everybody, that sees everybody as a citizen, not 3/5 a human being, and that we have to amend and then put a but clause in when we abolish slavery, but that everyone has a full participation in this thing called democracy, so that we can all have one vote, no gerrymandering, no ability to do that. That's how I'm looking at it. So
I agree with the sentiment. I'm not sure that you need to make any changes to the actual Constitution in order to bring that about, though, because the problem is the interpretation of the Constitution by the Supreme Court. You can find a very strong basis for eliminating gerrymandering in the Constitution. It's just the Supreme Court won't go along with it. But you're right. I mean, on the one hand, at the beginning, it wasn't just Black people who were excluded from the Constitution. It was also women. Now, not explicitly in the Constitution, there were women voting in many states, particularly the northeastern states, Delaware, New Jersey. Women were voting right up until the early 1800s. In fact, free Black people were voting in those states right up until around 1820. That was kind of the turning point when, kind of the rise of Andrew Jackson was when all, the final states started cracking down on free Black people voting and women voting. And we went to just white men. But, the bottom line is that's where it was. That said, this was the first serious experiment with democracy in 2,000 years, really arguably in 3,000 years, because I don't think that you could really call the Roman Republic democratic. I mean, it had 100 years there where it was kind of close. In that regard, it was an incredibly radical experiment that everybody in the world was convinced was going to fail, because 7,000 years of human civilization, and it had always been kings, it had always been a hierarchy, it had always been oligarchy, And so just the idea that even just the white men could have a democracy was viewed as crazy. And by the time of the Civil War, there were only 3 or 4 other nations in the world that had adopted anything that resembled democracy, and the whole world held its breath, thinking, "This is it. We're all going to go back to kings," but we didn't. So I think that we've had steady progress since then, and we need to build on it, absolutely. But I think our biggest challenge is not so much rewriting the Constitution as it is repacking the Supreme Court, because they, in 1803, they claimed the power to essentially, strike down laws in the context of interpreting the Constitution, a power that is not given them in the Constitution itself, by the way. And but nobody has. Jefferson tried to stop them. He went nuts when the Marbury decision came down in 1803. He said, if this decision stands, the Constitution has become a thing of wax to be molded in the hands of the judiciary. He said, and the judiciary is the unelected and thus the most vulnerable to tyranny of all the branches of government. I mean, he just went crazy. And because of that, the Supreme Court from 1803 until 1856 didn't make a decision like they are now, literally every decision based on the Constitution. Instead, they were the way that they were envisioned as in the Constitution, which is the final court of appeals, where you have somebody sues somebody and then they sue back, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. The buck has to stop someplace. And then in 1856, that was the second big decision based on the Supreme Court deciding that they knew best what the Constitution said. And that was Dred Scott, which brought us the Civil War, and and its own craziness. And then the next time they did that was 1896. Well, actually, there was one in 1886, but the big one was in 1896. I think it was v. Sanford. What am I missing here? The separate but equal. Plessy versus Ferguson.
I was going to say Plessy versus Ferguson.
It was Dred Scott v. Sanford, and those were, just really 3 times in the entire 19th century. Now, literally, if the court decides 100 cases, 95 of them will be basically striking down laws, writing laws, creating laws, based on this BS interpretation of the Constitution.
Which, the 2016 election, to me, was all about the courts. Ruth Bader Ginsburg refused to leave because she wanted to, I guess, Hillary Clinton to appoint her successor. But it was incredibly short-sighted, arrogant, and wrong to stay somewhere thinking that things are going to don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And then I said the next president is going to appoint definitely 1, maybe 2, maybe 3. And I was absolutely right. And I said Hillary Clinton is not the issue. It's the Supreme Court. And very few people listened. 100 million people sat home, and we got Donald Trump. And he appointed 3 people to the Supreme Court. Now, you're suggesting Thom Hartmann is here, of course, author and radio host, but he's a person, and I wanted to sit with the history because I feel like we're in a time where no one reads. When I say that, of course, there are people who read. This audience reads. But reading for comprehension, reading for understanding, reading to know how these dots are connected and how these threads are sewing a bigger fabric. Is super important, and I feel like we don't have the memory to be able to even have discussions anymore, right? So I'm quiet because you've done the work. I know some things, but I want us to be educated. So as we move forward into this, Thom Hartmann, as you so wonderfully laid this out, we have a president right now who refuses to pack the court for this reason, I imagine, because if he does it, then the next person can add 3 more seats, and then the next person can add 3 more seats. And because there's no set number of Supreme Court justices, this thing could, the way it looks like right now, with people just being ridiculous. I'm looking at Congress; they can't even get a Speaker of the House in, even though they know damn well Jim Jordan's never going to win. This is so crazy. So I get why President Biden is not packing the court, because I don't know if he's going to win in the next election, and whoever wins there will go, "Oh, you packed it. I'm gonna pack it even more."
Well, I think probably the main reason why he's not even engaging in a conversation about it is because it would require Congress. And, with Manchin and Sinema in the Senate being unwilling to vote against a filibuster, the For the People Act is a great example of that, a real tragedy. and not controlling the House of Representatives, there's literally nothing that could be done. And so if he took the position that he wanted to pack the court, it would just blow up in his face, and it would be a huge, political thing, and it would encourage a whole bunch of Republican voters. I do think in 2024, if he holds the White House and we can increase our majority in the Senate and get back the House, that there's a very good chance you're going to see some real substantial changes to the Supreme Court. At the very least, probably term limits and a judicial code of ethics, and possibly packing the court. I mean, it's happened a lot. When John Adams was leaving the White House in 1800, and his at that point bitter enemy, his vice president Thomas Jefferson, was coming in, he was so pissed off at Jefferson that he got Congress in the final months of his presidency to shrink the size of the court, because there was one guy who just died, and so that Jefferson wouldn't be able to appoint anybody. So Jefferson had a big enough majority in Congress that he was able to actually add to a couple of members to the court. Same thing happened around the Civil War. When Andrew Johnson became president, he was a slaveholder, and the Republicans were not fond of him, and there was an opening on the court, and so Congress convened and they shrank the size of the court from 9 down to 7. Even though there were 8 members on the court at the time, so that Johnson couldn't appoint anybody. And then, when Johnson left, Ulysses S. Grant came back in and cranked it back up to 9. So there is a history there that could be played out. But I think really the reason that we're not hearing much about it is because it's just physically impossible.
Not going to happen.
Or politically impossible.
I've been you've written about the Civil War as well, and you've talked about the Cold War that we're in. I believe that the Civil War never ended. I feel like that battle was won, but it has never ended, and it's why we still see Confederate flags waved. It's why people are still marching in the streets, with khaki pants and tiki torches, talking about replacement, which we don't talk enough about either. It's like they said the Jews will not replace us, and there's a very strong strain of anti-Jewish behavior among these white evangelicals as well. We don't tie it to them. It's all Muslim versus no. There's something else going on here, which has been this way since the inception of this country. And I'm looking at where we are, and I'm like, this Civil War that we're in, I don't think many people are prepared to fight. Like I don't think they even understand what's at stake here. What's at stake for you, Thom? You're a man of a certain age with a certain background. For you, you're gonna be okay, I think, no matter what happens. But you're still in this fighting.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll be dead long before, well, I don't know. I was going to say big changes happen, but I think big changes are going to happen in the next couple of years, and hopefully I won't be dead then. I'm 72, so. But in any case, I don't know. I'm not sure exactly what you're asking, Karen.
I'm asking, where are we right now? And in your estimation of
with regard to the Civil War stuff, and
not just this country, was the question that I asked at the beginning. Like, this thing doesn't seem like it's going to last.
I think
should it last? Should it stay?
Yeah. Well, I think what we're seeing right now in some ways is dueling cults. There's this within the white supremacist movement in the United States. The Jews will not replace us, and what they meant when they said that was this theory that wealthy Jews are paying Black people and Hispanic people to replace white people. That's the conspiracy theory that these guys were expressing when they said Jews will not replace us. It wasn't that they were concerned that a Jew was going to replace them at work. It was they were concerned that a Black person or a Hispanic person was going to replace them at work, and that the employer who was Jewish would have done it, or that George Soros would have paid for it.
Okay.
So that's the great replacement theory. And there's a book that is kind of a Bible to the white supremacist movement called Camp of the Saints, which is where this came from. It was written in French by a French guy back in the 60s or 70s. And, it's one of these kind of war against all books. The one that most Americans are more familiar with is the Turner Diaries, which is the book that animated Tim McVeigh. And in the Turner Diaries, the Jews are replacing white people by hiring black people and Hispanics, and the good God-fearing Christian white people who are really upset about this blow up a federal building. Um, Again, this was Tim McVeigh's inspiration. Blowing up the federal building causes the president to overreact and order a nationwide gun confiscation program. When the jackbooted thugs show up to confiscate guns, that trips off the Civil War. And by the end of the book, the only people left standing are the white people. All the quote mud races, a phrase that probably appears 300 times in the book, are dead, and including the Jews. And it's just the good Christian white people, for whom this nation was originally intended in the minds of these crazy, demented people. Although there is some historical accuracy to that in the minds of some of the founders. But anyhow, that's their theory. That's their belief, is that if they can get people pissed off enough and find some inciting incident, some event which is going to trip off the war, that there will actually be a war. And we now have 400 million guns in the United States. I mean,
400 million.
We've added over 100 million guns just in the last 10 years. I mean, just a little more than that, just since the election of Obama. It really started with Obama's election. The first book in my series, the Hidden History series book, is about guns. And I tell the story. I open the book with the story of 2008, Christmas 2008. And that at that point, we had just short of 300 million guns in America. It wasn't anything close to what it is now. And one of my brothers is a gun enthusiast. He's not a right winger. He's not a racist. He's not a crazy. He's been a sport, what do you call it, target shooting guy since he was in Cub Scouts. And so he's got a couple of guns, and he lives out in the woods, and we do target practice when I go visit him. So we went to this gun range in Mason, Michigan. It's the biggest gun range in central Michigan. And they were almost out of bullets. And I wanted to buy some bullets. We were going to shoot on the range, me and my brother and another one of my brothers and a couple of our nephews. And so I asked the guy, I said, how come you're out of bullets? And he said, because that N-word, and he didn't say N-word, you know what I mean? He said, because that N-word who just got elected is going to take away all our guns. Now, this was Christmas. This was the week of Christmas of 2008. Obama wouldn't be inaugurated for another 4 weeks. And I said, what are you talking about? That's crazy. And he's like, no, it's not. He pulls out his smartphone and he shows me an email, from some whack job, talking about here's how Obama's going to confiscate I read it, and it was like the Turner Diaries. It was like right out of the Turner Diaries. But it had really worked. I mean, every gun store, there's a Wikipedia page for the great ammunition shortage of 2008. It happened again in 2012 when Obama got reelected. And so, that was the explosion. It was all these white people expecting that they had to get ready for the race war that was coming. And they're dead serious about it. And the numbers are huge, and they're always underestimated and underreported. And frankly, I think the media doesn't even like to talk about them because they're afraid of some juice. But they're out there and they're real, and there's millions of them.
So what do we do? 866-801-8255. I know everything you're saying is true. As a child, Helter Skelter and Charlie Manson scared the hell out of me. He too was trying to start a race war by killing Sharon Tate and cutting her child out of her stomach and blaming black people for that. And she was beloved, I guess, as a starlet, Roman Polanski's baby's mama. And I think about, as a child, Charlie Manson scared me. He had that cross on his forehead, and then there was hints of this Nazi stuff, and I was also obsessed with watching the Holocaust things like Sobibor and Playing for Time, and just understanding that this could happen here, and it could happen here again. And this time it's so much easier to round up black people You know, Jewish folk, some of them had to pull down their pants to show, some of them, their fellow neighbors turned them in because you couldn't tell who was a Jew. I mean, Oppenheimer was blue eyed and built with an Aryan nose. You know what I'm saying? Oppenheimer. Who's a Jew? Black people were easy targets. So
Yeah.
I always thought it could happen. And now you're saying, like, I feel like there's these underground little bunker places, people not just prepping, but absolutely training for a time when they're going to turn on their neighbors, but not their neighbors because white folk, 3/4 of them self-segregate. So they're already in these pockets where we don't even know what's going on.
Yeah.
And Tom, you live in one of them areas, one of them out remote areas, not a lot of black folk there. It's like Utah, it's like all, so it's ripe for that, right? And we all live, black folk, most of us, off of major highways where tanks can just come in. It's scary when you think about that's what's really planned. Well, we talk about all this government stuff and voting. That's really what's at the crux of this is whiteness and the protection of whiteness and the power of it and the preservation of it. This
Yep.
is what is destroying, I believe, this thing we call democracy or this country, period. And we will not be able to get white folk to remove themselves from their whiteness. We will not be able to do that.
Yeah, and the biggest challenge we have is that one of the two major political parties, a billion-dollar corporation, the Republican National Committee, the Republican Party, with a base everywhere, all across the country, has adopted white supremacy explicitly as as a core principle. Now, they did it less explicitly, starting with Nixon's Southern strategy. I mean, that's basically what that was all about. It's not like we've ever been a country without that, but now it's super front and center. And I am not one of those people who thinks that there will be a civil war in the United States. I think that there's probably going to be more and more stochastic terrorism, lone wolf crazies and things like that. And there's probably going to be more and more Bundy confrontation kind of things, only probably some of them are going to start going south. But the Republican Party is not doing us any favors here.
But Thom Hartmann,
As a country.
I don't think any of them are lone wolves. They all have manifestos. I don't know. There's a system. There's an institution behind a Ted
Yep.
Bundy and a Timothy McVeigh and the last Cretin that shot up those folk in Buffalo and the person that went into to the church in Charleston, the folk that ran over Heather Heyer. There's a manifesto and an organization behind it, and money. And money. It's not just, these aren't lone wolves. They are informed by something, and now it's even easier because we can centralize. They can target on Reddit. Like, there's no longer any media, which you talk about. I'm going to read from the preface of The Hidden History of American Oligarchy, Reclaiming Our Democracy from the Ruling Class. You write, this book was written during the spring and summer of 2020. And although it was published in early spring of 2021, the vagaries of the publishing business didn't allow for any last-minute edits or changes after November 3rd, the 2020 elections. If Donald Trump was reelected, you wrote this before, if Donald Trump was reelected or somehow managed to remain president after January 20th, 2021, then we must take to the streets. This is Thom Hartmann writing. This is most likely democracy's last stand. If Joe Biden or another Democrat was elected, we have a lot of work to do. Many of the holes, cracks, and weaknesses in our republic that Trump exploited were put into place by the Supreme Court in the 1970s and by Congress after 9/11. The Buckley and Bellotti Supreme Court decisions of the 1970s legalized bribery and political corruption by giving corporations and billionaires the free speech right to own politicians and political parties. The Patriot Act and other similar legislation since 9/11 has given the president vast surveillance and police powers that we've seen used in authoritarian strongman governments throughout history. We must reevaluate, rescind, and replace all of these with legislation that protects the rule of law, circumscribes presidential war-making powers, blocks foreign countries and oligarchs from corrupting our political process, and takes political power away from American oligarchs and returns it to the people. Do you have any hope that any of this will happen, Thom Hartmann?
I do. I actually do. The For the People Act really shocked me. This was one of the moments that gave me probably more hope than anything in the last 5 years. And that was that here's a piece of legislation that cuts back on dark money in politics, that outlaws gerrymandering, that would force, I mean, it would have been just a radical change in the American political landscape. It passed the House of Representatives. Every single Democrat voted for it. Every single Republican voted against it, but it passed. It went to the Senate, and it got 51 votes in the Senate, with the tie-breaking vote from Kamala Harris, which should have made it law, except the Republicans filibustered it. Had Sinema and Manchin voted to break this filibuster, it would be law right now, and we would be having a very different conversation. We would be living in a very different country. Sadly, they were corrupted. They were bought and paid off, and Sinema's now even left the Democratic Party. But the fact that it got that far shocked me. I did not expect that a direct head-on confrontational challenge to not just Citizens United, but 250 some odd years of gerrymandering, or 40 some odd years, would be successful. I mean, it blew me away. And what that tells me is that if we can hold the Senate and ideally pick up a couple more seats so we don't have a Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema problem, and if we can regain control of the House of Representatives and hold the White House, and I really think, Karen, all those things are possible, in part because so many Americans are so pissed off about abortion, frankly, which, only peripherally has anything to do with any of this, but it is a huge animating issue right now. I'm actually very, very hopeful. I think there's and the Democratic Party, prior to Joe Biden's presidency, we had a Democratic Party that, starting in the 90s, in the early 90s, had basically abandoned the classic principles of the Democratic Party. They had abandoned the New Deal. They'd abandoned Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. Bill Clinton cut back on welfare. He term limited everything to five years, or term limit's the wrong phrase, but you know what I mean. Gutted many of the systems, the programs that LBJ had put into place. Barack Obama was still taking huge money from corporations and basically kowtowing to them. Even Obamacare is basically a $1 trillion gift to the big insurance companies. Joe Biden came along and said, we're going to abandon that. We're that neoliberal stuff that Clinton and Obama bought into, kind of going along with Reagan light. We're not going to do any of that anymore. We're going to go all in on labor. We're going to go all in on bringing manufacturing home. We're going to stop this craziness of offshoring all our jobs. I mean, I don't know if you caught it just yesterday. They banned the export of high-tech chips to China, which is another way of, forcing manufacturing back here to the United States. The Democratic Party has woken the hell up, or at least a large chunk of it. You still have the problem solver caucus. You still have 20, 30 Democrats who are proudly on the take. But by and large, the Democratic Party is back to its pre-1990 roots. And I think that's a really good thing. And I'm very hopeful. I really am.
She smiles and says that she loves me. Isn't it lovely when the one you're lusting is the one?